21 miles. That's the width of the Strait of Hormuz at its narrowest point. Through that gap passes roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply every single day, somewhere around 20 million barrels. Right now, two hostile military forces are imposing blockades on opposite ends of that passage. Iran controls the transit corridor through the strait itself. The United States has just declared a full naval blockade of every Iranian port and coastline on the other side. This has no modern precedent, and the consequences for oil, for shipping, for the global economy, and for the risk of a wider war are enormous. Here's exactly what's happening, how it works, and what comes next. To understand why this matters more than almost any other military confrontation on the planet right now, you need to understand what Hormuz actually is. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the open Indian Ocean and the rest of the world. Every drop of crude oil exported from Saudi Arabia's eastern terminals, from Kuwait, from Qatar, from the United Arab Emirates, from Bahrain, from Iraq's southern ports, all of it funnels through this single passage. We're talking about approximately 20% of global petroleum consumption and roughly a quarter of the world's liquefied natural gas trade. There is no pipeline alternative that comes close to replacing this volume. There is no canal. There is no second route. If Hormuz closes, the global energy market doesn't adjust. It seizes. Now, here's the geographic detail that makes this situation legally and militarily extraordinary. The strait at its narrowest is 21 nautical miles across. Iran claims 12 nautical miles of territorial sea from its coast. Oman claims 12 nautical miles from its coast. 12 plus 12 is 24. The strait is only 21 miles wide. That means there is no sliver of international water running through the middle. Every square meter of the Strait of Hormuz is sovereign territorial water belonging to either Iran or Oman. The only reason commercial shipping has ever been able to transit freely is a specific provision in international law, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1 Clause, Part 3, which establishes the right of transit passage through straits used for international navigation. Under normal circumstances, neither Iran nor Oman can legally restrict ships from passing through, but these are not normal circumstances. And that legal framework is now being tested by two simultaneous opposing blockade regimes that threaten to collapse it entirely. Let's start with what Iran has already established, because their system was in place first. In the weeks following the outbreak of hostilities, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, effectively seized control of transit through the Strait of Hormuz. They rerouted all vessel traffic away from the internationally recognized traffic separation scheme, the standard two-lane maritime highway that ships have used for decades, and declared that corridor a restricted hazardous area. Instead, they funneled inbound traffic through a lane north of Larak Island and outbound traffic south of it. Every vessel transiting under this system must pass through what amounts to an IRGC checkpoint. Iran is deciding who enters, who leaves, and under what conditions. Now, several US-linked vessels have been effectively trapped inside the Persian Gulf. So here's the critical question. Is what Iran is doing actually a lawful blockade under international law? The law of naval warfare, codified most recently in the Newport Manual, published by the U.S. Naval War College in 2025, lays out 4 specific requirements that any blockade must meet to be recognized as legitimate. First, notification. A blockading power must formally declare the geographic scope, the commencement date, and the enforcement measures. Iran has made its restrictions known, though the formality of their declaration is debatable. Second, effectiveness. The blockade must be actively enforced with sufficient military force to create a genuine risk of interception. The IRGC's presence in the strait with fast attack craft, naval patrols, and the physical checkpoint system arguably meets this threshold. Third, humanitarian requirements. A blockade cannot be designed solely to starve a civilian population or deprive them of goods essential for survival. This is where Iran's regime starts to strain. The restriction of neutral commercial shipping through the strait, including vessels carrying food, fuel, and consumer goods to non-Iranian Gulf states, raises serious questions about whether civilian populations in the broader region are being affected. And fourth, access to neutral coasts. A blockade must not bar access to ports and coastlines belonging to neutral nations, nor restrict passage through straits used for international navigation in neutral waters. This is the most significant legal problem for Iran. The Strait of Hormuz serves Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, none of whom are parties to the US-Iran conflict. By controlling all transit through the strait, Iran is functionally restricting access to neutral coasts, which is a direct violation of the law of naval warfare. Under UNCLOS, which governs peacetime maritime law, what Iran is doing is straightforwardly illegal. Transit passage cannot be suspended or restricted, but UNCLOS assumes a state of peace. The moment a de facto state of war exists, the legal framework shifts to the law of armed conflict and blockade law takes over. Even under that framework, though, Iran's regime has significant legal vulnerabilities, particularly on the humanitarian and neutral coast criteria, none of which changes the practical reality. Iran controls the physical choke point, and ships are complying because the alternative is confrontation with the IRGC. And then the United States added a second layer. U.S. Central Command issued a formal notice to mariners declaring a naval blockade of all Iranian ports and coastal areas, effective 1400 UTC on April 13th. The scope is comprehensive. The blockade encompasses the entirety of Iran's coastline, including all ports and oil export terminals. A direct reference to Karg Island, which handles the vast majority of Iran's crude oil exports. Verify fact. Confirm Karg Island's percentage of Iranian crude exports. But here's what's operationally significant about where the US is enforcing it. The enforcement zone is not inside the Persian Gulf. It's not off the coast of Bandar Abbas or in the strait itself. The US has positioned its enforcement zone in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, east of the Strait of Hormuz in the open ocean approaches. This is a deliberate choice, and it tells you several things about American strategic thinking. The US does not want to operate inside the confined waters of the strait, where IRGC fast attack boats, coastal missile batteries, and mine-laying capabilities create an extremely dangerous environment for large surface combatants. Instead, they're pulling the enforcement perimeter out to deeper, more open water, where American naval advantages in surveillance, in surface warfare, in aviation are maximized. The CENTCOM notice specifies that the blockade applies to all vessel traffic regardless of flag state. Neutral vessels that were in Iranian ports at the time of the declaration were granted a grace period to depart. After that window closed, any vessel entering or leaving the blockaded area without authorization became subject to interception, diversion, and capture. Critically, the notice states that neutral transit passage through the Strait of Hormuz to or from non-Iranian destinations will not be impeded. So if you're a tanker heading to a UAE port or a container ship bound for Kuwait, the US blockade does not apply to you, at least in principle. However, neutral vessels may still be subject to visit and search to verify they're not carrying contraband to Iran. The notice also includes a humanitarian carve-out. Food, medical supplies, and goods essential for civilian survival will be permitted, subject to inspection. Now, let's run this through the same 4 criteria legal test. Notification met. The CENTCOM notice specifies geographic scope, commencement date, and enforcement measures in explicit detail. Effectiveness. This is where it gets interesting. A blockade must be maintained by sufficient force to create a credible threat of interception. The US currently has significant naval assets in the region. The USS Tripoli Amphibious Ready Group, built around an amphibious assault ship and 2 amphibious transport docks, provides the marine expeditionary capability needed for boarding operations against commercial vessels. The USS John L. Canley, an expeditionary sea base, extends the operational reach and provides a platform for helicopter operations across a wider area. Together, these assets can project boarding teams across the northern Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman, and reinforcements are inbound. The Boxer Amphibious Ready Group departed Hawaii approximately a week ago and should arrive in theater within 2 to 3 weeks. Additional assets from the 7th Fleet are reportedly being repositioned. The USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group has arrived in the Mediterranean. There was also a recent call-up of Navy Reserve Strategic Sealift Officers, SSOs, who hold merchant marine licenses. That is a highly specific personnel mobilization. SSOs exist for one purpose in a scenario like this:
to board seized commercial vessels and sail them to a designated holding location using the existing crew or replacement mariners. That call-up signals that the U.S. military is preparing not just to intercept ships, but to capture and relocate them. Humanitarian requirements addressed in the notice, though the practical implementation will be the real test. Access to neutral coasts explicitly addressed. The U.S. has stated it will not impede transit to non-Iranian Gulf destinations. On paper, the U.S. blockade is more legally rigorous than Iran's. It was formally declared with specific parameters, it carves out neutral transit and humanitarian access, and it's being enforced outside the strait to avoid restricting passage to neutral ports.
Whether it holds up under sustained international scrutiny is another question, but the legal groundwork is significantly more careful. So take a step back and consider what we're looking at. Two military forces in a de facto state of war have each imposed their own blockade regime on the same body of water. Iran controls the internal choke point. The United States controls the external approaches. Commercial shipping is now caught between two competing systems of coercion, each backed by military force, each with its own rules, each with the capacity to seize your vessel. And this is where the situation gets genuinely dangerous, not just for the ships, but for the global economy. Let's talk about the scenarios that could turn this from a tense standoff into something much worse. The boarding problem.
When the U.S. Navy was conducting interdiction operations against Venezuelan oil tankers earlier in this conflict cycle, those were commercial vessels with civilian crews, operating outside a war zone. The risk profile for boarding operations was manageable. Boarding a vessel coming out of an Iranian port during an active armed conflict is a fundamentally different proposition. How do you know the IRGC hasn't placed military personnel aboard commercial tankers as a deterrent? How do you know the vessel hasn't been rigged with explosive devices or booby traps? What if crew members are armed with shoulder-launched anti-aircraft missiles, manpads, that could bring down an approaching helicopter? Every boarding operation in this environment carries the risk of a firefight that could kill American service members and escalate the conflict overnight.
The U.S. military knows this, which is why the amphibious ready groups and marine expeditionary units are being deployed rather than Coast Guard law enforcement detachments. These are combat-configured forces prepared for hostile boardings. The China problem. This is the single most consequential escalation risk that almost nobody is discussing in sufficient depth. China is Iran's largest oil customer. A significant portion of Iran's crude exports transported by what the industry calls the shadow fleet, vessels operating with obscured ownership, flags of convenience, and deceptive shipping practices, ultimately ends up at Chinese refineries. Now, the U.S. blockade applies to all vessel traffic, regardless of flag. That means if a Chinese-flagged vessel, crewed by Chinese nationals, departs Karg Island loaded with crude oil, the U.S. Navy has declared the legal authority to intercept, board, and capture that ship. Imagine that scenario for a moment.
An American warship stops a Chinese commercial vessel in the Gulf of Oman. Marines board it. The crew resists or China objects. Suddenly, you don't have a U.S.-Iran confrontation. You have a U.S.-China incident at sea, and the diplomatic consequences of that are in an entirely different category. China has not yet signaled how it would respond to the interdiction of its flagged vessels. But Beijing has historically treated interference with Chinese-flagged commercial shipping as a sovereignty issue. If China decides to provide naval escorts for its tankers, something it has the capability to do from its base in Djibouti or from deployed naval task forces in the Indian Ocean, the complexity of this standoff multiplies exponentially, the insurance shockwave. For the commercial shipping industry, the immediate impact isn't the blockades themselves, it's what the blockades do to insurance. War risk insurance premiums for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman have been climbing since the conflict began, but dual blockade declarations accelerate this dramatically. The Lloyd's Market Association Joint War Committee, which designates listed areas requiring additional war risk coverage, has already flagged the Persian Gulf. When war risk premiums spike, the cost of every single voyage through the region increases, sometimes by hundreds of thousands of dollars per transit. Protection and indemnity clubs, the mutual insurers that cover liability for ship owners, face exposure calculations that change by the hour in a dual blockade environment. Hull and machinery underwriters are repricing risk for any vessel that enters these waters. The practical effect is immediate. Some ship owners will simply refuse to send their vessels. We've already seen this.
Vessels that were heading into the Persian Gulf have abandoned their transits and turned around.
When enough ships refuse the risk, freight rates for the vessels still willing to make the run increase. Those costs pass directly to commodity prices, which pass to refiners, which pass to consumers. This is how a naval blockade 18,000 kilometers away from a gas station in Ohio changes the price on the pump. The Houthi wildcard. And then there's the Bab el-Mandeb. Yemen's Houthi forces have been conducting anti-shipping operations in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden for months. If the Houthis, who are aligned with Iran, decide to escalate their campaign in coordination with the Hormuz crisis, the consequences compound dramatically. Saudi Arabia's Western oil export terminal at Yanbu on the Red Sea coast is the kingdom's primary alternative to its Persian Gulf terminals. If Hormuz is effectively restricted and Houthi attacks simultaneously threaten the Red Sea route, Saudi Arabia loses viable export pathways in both directions.
That scenario, simultaneous chokepoint disruption at Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb, would represent the most severe supply-side shock to global energy markets since the 1973 Arab oil embargo. Possibly worse, because the 1973 embargo was a political decision that could be reversed with a political decision. Dual military blockades require military resolution. Let's quantify what's at stake. Approximately 20 million barrels of crude oil transit the Strait of Hormuz daily. That represents roughly 20% of global consumption. If both blockades are sustained and effectively enforced, meaning Iranian exports are halted by the US and neutral shipping is deterred by Iran, the immediate supply gap would be catastrophic. Strategic petroleum reserves held by the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, and China could buffer the impact temporarily, but global SPR levels have been drawn down significantly over the past several years.
The International Energy Agency's emergency response mechanisms were designed for supply disruptions, but not for a sustained dual blockade of the world's most critical energy choke point. Oil futures markets are already pricing in elevated risk. But if this standoff persists for weeks rather than days, the price floor moves substantially higher. Analysts' estimates vary, but a sustained closure of Hormuz has historically been modeled to push crude prices above $150 per barrel. The ripple effects extend far beyond energy. Petrochemical feedstocks, fertilizer production, plastics manufacturing, and air freight fuel costs all amplify through the global economy. Countries heavily dependent on Gulf energy imports, Japan, South Korea, India, and much of Europe, face the most immediate exposure. So what are both sides actually trying to accomplish? Neither Iran nor the United States has an interest in a permanent closure of the Strait of Hormuz.
Iran's economy depends on oil exports passing through it. The United States' Gulf allies depend on it for their entire economic model. The global economy depends on it for price stability. A permanently closed Hormuz is a catastrophe for everyone, including the nations imposing the blockades. This is economic coercion aimed at the negotiating table. Both sides are applying maximum pressure to force the other into concessions, most likely through the diplomatic track reportedly running through Islamabad. The US blockade is designed to strangle Iran's oil revenue, the single most important source of hard currency for the Iranian government. Without export income, Iran's ability to sustain military operations, fund proxy forces, and maintain domestic economic stability degrades rapidly. Iran's control of the strait is designed to demonstrate that any attempt to isolate Iran economically will carry an unacceptable cost for the entire global economy. It's a hostage strategy. If you cut off our exports, we'll disrupt everyone's exports. The question is, which side blinks first, and whether the mechanisms of escalation, a botched boarding, a Chinese-flagged interception, a Houthi attack on a Saudi terminal, overtake the mechanisms of diplomacy before a deal can be reached. Historical precedent offers some guidance, though imperfect. During the tanker war of the 1980s, the U.S. Navy conducted Operation Earnest Will to escort reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Gulf, a sustained naval operation that lasted from 1987 to 1988 and involved direct combat between U.S. and Iranian naval forces, including the destruction of Iranian oil platforms and warships during Operation Praying Mantis.
That crisis ultimately ended at the negotiating table, but not before significant military escalation.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the United States imposed what it called a quarantine, legally distinct from a blockade to avoid triggering war powers implications, to prevent Soviet missiles from reaching Cuba. That standoff lasted 13 days and brought the world closer to nuclear war than any event before or since. The common thread in both cases: blockades create pressure, but they also create time pressure. The longer they persist, the higher the probability of an incident that neither side planned or wanted. 3 scenarios from here are most plausible. Scenario 1, negotiated de-escalation. Both sides use the blockades as leverage, reach a framework agreement in Islamabad, and mutually stand down. This is the best case and arguably the intended outcome for both parties. Watch for diplomatic signals, back-channel communications, and any softening of rhetoric from Tehran or Washington. Scenario 2, sustained siege. No deal is reached, but neither side escalates militarily. The blockades become a grinding economic war of attrition. Oil prices rise, shipping reroutes where possible, insurance markets adjust to a new risk baseline, and the global economy absorbs a sustained energy price shock. This is the most economically damaging scenario short of war. Scenario 3, military escalation. A boarding goes wrong. A Chinese-flagged vessel is seized. The Houthis launch a coordinated attack. An IRGC fast boat makes a miscalculation. Any of these triggers could spiral into direct combat that neither capital fully controls. This is the scenario everyone should be working to prevent. 21 miles of water, no international waters. 2 blockades, 20 million barrels a day at stake, and a negotiating table in Islamabad that may be the only thing standing between this standoff and the worst energy crisis in half a century. This situation is evolving by the hour. If you want to stay on top of it, subscribe and turn on notifications. This channel will be covering every major development as it happens. The next video breaks down, insert next relevant topic, e.g., what the insurance markets are telling us about how long this lasts, or the Chinese naval deployments that could change everything. I'll see you there.